We've been looking at the different ways in which people make their moral decisions so that we can place the Catholic approach in context. We see clearly that the Catholic approach could not be found in the subjectivist or relativistic approach where no actions in and of themselves are seen to be wrong. But there's also a way in which the legalistic approach is not true to the Catholic tradition either. I remember when I went off to study moral theology, I said to a priest that I was going to do this, an older priest. "Oh, you're going to study moral theology?" He said, "That's wonderful. We need more canon lawyers in the church." So he tended to think of morality in terms of the law. I wasn't going to study canon law. I was going to study moral theology. Now, I would say that the approach of the Catholic Church in the moral life is quite compatible with our human nature, and it's compatible with approaches to morality which have been taken by many who were not Catholics or were not Christians. Aristotle, for example, that great Greek philosopher, himself held that there were certain actions which simply could not be done under any circumstances, regardless of what the consequences might be. That there are certain actions which in and of themselves were wrong and should not be done. And he doesn't make particular reference to a law forbidding the action. He says if we reflect on the action, we can see that it doesn't conform to human nature. It's not going to bring about human flourishing and human happiness. Aristotle writes in his great work, The Nicomachean Ethics, there are some actions and emotions whose very names connote baseness. For example, spite, shamelessness, envy, and among actions, adultery, theft, and murder. These and similar emotions and actions imply by their very names that they are wrong. It is therefore impossible ever to do right in performing them. To perform them is always wrong. In cases of this sort, let us say adultery, rightness and wrongness do not depend on committing it with the right woman at the right time and in the right manner, but the mere fact of committing such action at all is to do wrong. So you see, it's not because there is a rule against adultery that we don't commit it. One man actually said to me one time, well, maybe if God had negotiated with Moses a little better on Mount Sinai, we'd have 9 commandments instead of 10, and he could have allowed, or could have made an exception with adultery. But of course that would be impossible, because it's not included because this was some arbitrary decision on the part of God, but rather the commandments reflect what is necessary for us to find our full happiness. It's like the mother telling the child, don't put your hand on that hot stove. It's interesting that our Holy Father, Pope John Paul II, likes to refer to the 10 Commandments as the Decalogue, which is another word for the 10 Commandments, taken from the Greek, deca, meaning 10, and log is taken from the Greek word logos, or word. And our Holy Father points out that in the 10 Commandments we have 10 words of guidance, 10 words of warning that show us what we must do and what we must avoid doing if we would find happiness. So we would say that the Catholic approach to morality is quite compatible with the insights that were achieved by great non-Christian thinkers, such as Plato, such as Socrates, such as Aristotle. Because if God created all things and the earth is His, it shouldn't be surprising to us that others also are able to come to some glimpse of what will lead to human happiness and human fulfillment. And in this approach, which I call the ethic of the good, which I say others subscribe to other than Catholics, in this approach of the ethic of the good, the question is asked, how do I find happiness? How do I find fulfillment? So we say that this approach to the moral life is eudaimonistic. Now, eudaimonistic is a big word, a fancy word, but it's taken from the Greek again, oidaimon, which means happy spirit. Our approach to the moral life conforms to the pursuit of happiness. This is what we are truly looking for in the moral life. When we're trying to decide whether we ought to perform a certain action or refrain from that action, we want to do what's going to bring us happiness, what's going to bring us fulfillment. And the Catholic Church says there's nothing wrong with that, because God wants us to be happy. God wants us to be fulfilled. And we are able to gain some insight into what we should or should not do simply by looking at ourselves squarely, clearly, with open minds. The conciliar document Gaudium et Spes, in its section on marriage, that is the pastoral constitution of the Church in the modern world, says that we should be able to look to the human person and derive from him objective criteria which will lead our lives. We can look to the human person and know what is going to be necessary for us to attain fulfillment. Okay? I mean, just even something as basic as our instinct for eating. We can see that that's given to us for our good. We as Catholics say we believe that God's given it to us for our good. And so we know that if you abuse it, you eat too much food, you eat unbalanced meals, nothing but sweets and ice cream or snacks, that this isn't going to lead to your flourishing, to your happiness. Okay? So we can gain some understanding of the kinds of choices we ought to be making by looking to the human person himself or herself.